Hello, I'm Drew Fagan. I'm a professor at the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto and a co-project director of the ON360 initiative at the Monk School, which is aimed at examining issues fundamental to Ontario's future progress in economic areas, social policy, and others. And I'm joined today by Speer, who's an assistant professor at the Monk School, and by Jonah Goldberg, who's a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto and a research fellow at the Monk School. And they have issued in the last few days a paper on Canadian fiscal federalism. In fact, that's its name, Reforming Canadian Fiscal Federalism, the Case for Intergovernmental Disentanglement. Sometimes it seems like fiscal federalism is a topic we've been discussing in this country for decades. In fact, we have, and that's where, in fact, I just want to start. And that is, Jonah, take me through a little bit the history of relations, fiscal relations between primarily the provinces and the federal government, how that's evolved over time. And then from there, we can bring ourselves up to the present and some of the policy prescriptions that we suggest in this paper.
Okay, perfect. And thank you to Drew and Sean for working with me in developing this paper, and Sean for co-authoring it. I think the place to start really would be Confederation. When Confederation was being designed, the fathers of Confederation, particularly Sir John A. Macdonald, wanted to design a federation where you would have the federal level that was in charge of most of the important policy areas, and that you would have provincial governments that could deal with more local issues. There were three provinces who are primarily concerned with maintaining control over culture and education and other issues. But it was assumed at the time of Confederation that the federal government would be spending the vast majority of the money. Obviously, the welfare state hadn't emerged yet, and so ultimately what happened over decades following Confederation is that three areas that the provinces were in charge of, being education, healthcare, and welfare, all became much more important and much more costly. And so what you began to see, particularly when the Great Depression began, was a real fiscal pressure on the provinces, as they were having to start really paying for a lot more than had been intended through Confederation. It was thought that healthcare and education would not be particularly important issues in 1867, but of course they did become very important issues. And so as you had the Great Depression occur, it was very clear that the provinces did not have the fiscal capacity to be responsible for the areas that they were given in the British North America Act. And so the federal government decided to start a commission, the Roy Commission, in 1937 to examine what would be called fiscal federalism in Canada, the revenue balance, the expense balance, and how that might have to be adjusted. The commission came back with a lot of sweeping recommendations. Really, the only recommendation that was adopted immediately was to transfer being in charge of welfare from the provinces to the federal government through a constitutional amendment in 1940. But that really didn't solve a whole lot of other problems. And the Roy Commission made several very sweeping recommendations. Eventually, one of the recommendations, which would be the provincial equalization program, was instituted under the Roy government. And then really what began to happen as you got into the 1960s with the emergence of the government-funded healthcare, actions were more important, were huge fiscal pressures. So rather than take a big bang approach where the federal government might transfer some of its taxation powers, or the provinces might transfer some responsibility for certain areas, essentially what happened beginning in 1966 under the Pearson government was federal government programs designed to match provincial spending in areas of healthcare and education and social assistance. This became rather unaffordable over time, and the federal government recognized they wouldn't want to be having to match provincial spending continuously as it would increase, as that would become unaffordable. And so what you had under the Trudeau government and then under the Chrétien government was a move toward block funding to the provinces to help pay for healthcare and education. But the reality is that there has not been a lot of change in fiscal federalism. Much of the Rollo-Sewell Commission was never actually implemented. It had some great ideas, but constitutionally and politically, it's proven to be more difficult. So essentially, the federal government transfers tens of billions of dollars a year to the provincial governments to help pay for things like healthcare and education, which is why you see such a mismatch in terms of provincial responsibilities and the federal power of the purse. And this is only accelerating in the wake of the pandemic and as our population ages going forward.
That's a primer, Jonah, in a few minutes on the history of fiscal federalism. Well done. I think the point about coherence is fundamental, and we're going to get to that in terms of really the premise of the paper, which is how do we bring greater coherence to federalism, fiscal federalism, including with the third level of government, third order government, municipalities. I think your key point, though, is that, you mentioned, Big Bang. You used the term Big Bang, and the fact that we haven't, for the most part, had a Big Bang approach. All the same, over the course of decades, the importance of the provinces in terms of their spending versus the feds have changed very much from, 1867 or even a century ago. Sean, take me through a little bit of that, and that sort of takes us up to today more in the situation with the pandemic.
Well, I feel a bit self-conscious after Jonah's tour de force, but I think he does a tremendous job of kind of unpacking the history of Canadian federalism in a couple of short minutes. One might think of it as the 20th century being, sort of the revenge against Macdonald. As Jonah says, Macdonald had conceived of a government in Canada that was top-heavy, where the provinces played a sort of limited role. And the history of the 20th century is that sort of flipped, didn't it? That the provinces came to have a much greater role in the day-to-day governance and policy making of the country, principally, as Jonah says, because of the growing importance of health, education, and social attitudes about the role of government and the welfare state, most of which resided at the provincial and increasingly the municipal level, which I think we'll probably get into. And what we've had to do, like most federal states, is arrange for some kind of process by which money flow and responsibilities flow up and down between Ottawa and the provinces and municipalities. And that's really what we mean when we talk about fiscal federalism. But as Jonah says, Canadian experience with fiscal federalism has tended to be evolutionary, not revolutionary. That is to say, rather than having a few key moments of systematic reform, what we've really seen in the sort of Canadian-esque way is a process by which the relationship between Ottawa and the provinces, both from a fiscal point of view, but also with respect to the division of powers, has sort of been a slow evolutionary iterative process. Jonah mentioned, for instance, the case of unemployment insurance being transferred upwards in 1940, maybe one of the few exceptions where we've seen a systematic approach of thinking about the relative responsibilities and revenue generating capacities of the different levels of government. And what we've come to in 2020 is a process by which, as Jonah says, Ottawa sends significant dollars to the provinces, both for the purposes of education and social services, underpinned by equalization, which serves the purpose of trying to equalize the revenue generating capacity of different provinces. Think, for instance, of the different revenue generating capacity of Alberta versus, say, some of the Atlantic Canadian provinces. And this system has, generally resulted in Canada having one of the most decentralized systems of federalism in the advanced world. That is to say, notwithstanding Macdonald's intentions in 1867, rather than having a top-heavy federalism, we actually have quite a bottom-heavy one, where the provinces have a significant role to play in revenue generation and spending. But what we're seeing, even before the pandemic, but increasingly, as Jonah says, exacerbated by the experience of the pandemic, is growing debate and questions about whether we're getting the mix right, whether the funding and the public service responsibilities are in effect aligned. And what's interesting, Drew, is that this conversation isn't just a two-way conversation between Ottawa and the provinces. It's increasingly a three-way conversation involving municipalities. As a previous Ontario 360 paper explained, our municipalities, particularly in the province of Ontario, are playing an increasingly important role in policy, governance, and service delivery. So all this to say, we're at a bit of an inflection point, I think, Drew, with respect to Canadian fiscal federalism. It seems likely that the experience of the pandemic is going to precipitate a kind of renewed focus on who's paying for, who's doing what, and who's paying for it, and what, if any, changes need to be made to try to bring greater coherence and ultimately fiscal sustainability across different levels of government. And so the question we try to engage with the paper is that conversation and those reforms going to come in the form of a big bang, which would involve a kind of big transformative set of changes to Canadian fiscal federalism? Or is it going to follow our historic path of a more evolutionary and iterative process? And depending on how one thinks about those questions, the implications for the province of Ontario, who, at the Ontario 360 project is our principal audience, is obviously critically important. And these are the types of things that we're trying to unpack and analyze on behalf of the province of Ontario.
Sean, you mentioned the pandemic, and I do want to put the context of fiscal federalism with all three orders of government into that situation right now. Does the profile of spending over the last 8 months change the underlying challenges that we're talking about? After all, most of that spending, the emergency spending with regard to the pandemic, has been federal. Does that rebalance the federation, or do we expect that to be a short-term challenge that just underlines the fact that we still have a long-term disentanglement agenda that we need to deal with to be most effective with taxpayers' dollars? I could question either of you.
Let me start to answer that, and then Jonah and his dog can weigh in. I think before the pandemic, Drew, the Parliamentary Budget Office in Ottawa had conducts every year a long-term fiscal sustainability report that analyzes both federal fiscal sustainability and subnational and provincial fiscal sustainability. And what those reports have shown for the past several years is that, well, Ottawa is moving on a track that is fiscally sustainable over time. Several of our provinces aren't. And the explanation for that is straightforward. It's because of aging demographics and the pressure that will place on provincially funded and provincially administered healthcare. And so prior to the pandemic, it just seemed inevitable that one way or the other, we were going to have to see some rebalancing in fiscal federalism to try to address this threat of fiscal unsustainability on the part of the provinces. It'll be interesting to see, Drew, when the pandemic is over, whether the Parliamentary Budget Office analysis has changed in any way. As you said, Ottawa has assumed a disproportionate role in the kind of fiscal costs associated with the pandemic. Everyone knows that its deficit is now north of $340 billion, an amount basically inconceivable just 12 months ago. And obviously that has come with significant debt accumulation. And so, at the end of the pandemic, when we try to reconcile all of the spending and what it means for the kind of long-term fiscal picture on the part of our different levels of government, we may discover that the analysis that we had leading into the pandemic has changed. But I don't think that fundamentally changes the basic question, which is how can we continue to refine and improve the functioning of Canadian federalism in general, and our fiscal federalism in particular, particularly in light of growing pressures, not just for our provinces, for our municipalities. So, I guess in sum, how we think about these questions might change slightly as a result of the pandemic and the fiscal costs associated, but I don't think it will cause us to set aside these bigger ongoing questions about the functioning of our federalism in Canada. Jonah, I don't know if you have something to...
Jonah, anything to add with that? And then we can get into the proposals we make with regard to how we can bring greater coherence to fiscal federalism at all three orders of government.
Yeah, I mean, if I could, there were certainly 2/3 of Canada's provinces, according to the PBO, were on a fiscally unsustainable path before the pandemic. And so that's very clear. Another thing that I think is important for us to talk about is if we look at municipalities. Municipalities in Ontario are not allowed to run operating deficits. They can run deficits for capital projects, but they can't run operating deficits. And so there's a huge decline, as you'll see in the wake of the pandemic, in terms of revenue generated, perhaps through or loss of revenue generation through things like transit that people are taking a lot less, for example. And I think there's going to be substantial pressure on municipalities in Ontario in the near future. And it'll be interesting to see what happens, whether the provinces or the federal government will step in. And that might lead us into a discussion of disentanglement with respect to municipalities and provinces, as well as, of course, with the provinces and the federal government.
It does indeed. So let me ask you very simply, in the paper, there's a proposals, if you like, with regard to both a philosophy of disentanglement and details with regard to areas that government should be thinking about. First, to the philosophy of disentanglement. Sean, what are we talking about, and what are the challenges and the pluses from reforming the system we're in?
So viewers have heard thus far that Canadian fiscal federalism is under pressure. It was under pressure prior to the pandemic. It'll be under pressure after the pandemic. And momentum for fundamental reform, what you might call a big bang, seems to be building. And we'll see if that ultimately materializes. I think we would all agree in this conversation that there is indeed some justification for kind of a fundamental rethink with respect to major federal transfers and the division of powers. On the other hand, Drew, history tells us that the probability of success for sweeping reform to Canadian fiscal federalism may be limited. There's competing regional perspectives. There are obviously political and ideological differences. So the fact that the current federal government has ambitious plans, by all accounts, for the use of federal power. So for all of these reasons, the scope and potential for the kind of fundamental reform that some people are calling for at this stage, I think is too early to judge. But that doesn't mean that there isn't room for the kind of evolutionary, iterative improvements to the functioning of Canadian federalism that has really marked the history of these policy areas. And in particular, the paper outlines, as you say, the goal of intergovernmental disentanglement, which basically means that over time, through happenstance, we've observed a kind of growing overlap and duplication between what Ottawa, the provinces, and the municipalities do. This has not necessarily been done for nefarious reasons by any means. It's just the natural evolution of different governments intervening in different policy areas. Some cases, these are matters of shared jurisdiction, for instance. But the net effect of this kind of overlap and duplication is less accountability. Ontarians don't know who to blame if something's not working, if multiple levels of government are involved. Less scope for experimentation, because when you're involved with multiple layers of government, it can impede local or regional experimentation. Uncertainty and regulatory costs for business. You think of a business in Ontario that needs to obtain regulatory approval, in some cases by all three orders of government. And of course, higher costs. It's a bit cliche, but there's only one taxpayer. And if he or she is carrying the costs associated with different levels of government involved in the same policy area, the net effect can be higher overall spending by the governmental sector in Canada. So with all that to say, the paper says, we ought to look across the different orders of government at these areas where there are cases of overlap and duplication, and try to think systematically about which order of government is best positioned to carry out those programs or those policies or those functions, and to have the other levels of government retreat to enable the kind of accountability, experimentation, reduced regulatory burden, and ultimately lower costs that we think can come from a sustained, systematic, evidence-based exercise committed to the goal of an intergovernmental disentanglement.
So you believe in two philosophies with regard to public policy. One, there's only one taxpayer. Two, when it comes to accountability, you need one neck to choke, to boil it down. And I understand that well. So to either of you, provide maybe 2 or 3 examples of what we're talking about. And I know we at Ontario 360 have written about this specifically with regard to entanglement between municipalities and the provinces previously. Now we're talking really about both municipal, provincial, or territorial, provincial, federal, or circumstances, in fact, where all 3 orders of government are on top of each other. A couple of examples of what governments might be thinking about, and what in particular the Ontario government might think about with regard to leading an agenda like this.
Yeah, so I think I'll just start off. Maybe I'll give a provincial municipal example, and Sean can speak of federal, provincial, or additional examples. I think, and this is information taken from a previous Ontario 360 paper, that if we look at the reality here in Ontario, the province pays for 71% of social assistance, but only 14% of social housing. And so in both of those cases, you see overlap because municipalities are paying a chunk of that. And so is the province. And one, it's favored in one direction on one policy and another direction on another, which is interesting because one would imagine there's a lot of connection between social housing and social assistance. But the reality is that if Ontarians as individuals are frustrated with our social assistance programs, social housing, they have more than one door to knock on in terms of really looking for more accountability and perhaps changes. And as Sean said too, experimentation. When you have multiple levels of government in charge of providing a service that's very real in the lives of a lot of Ontarians, it's very difficult to try to call for reform when you're not quite sure exactly who should be facilitating that reform. And there are many other areas of overlap where it's closer to 50-50 in terms of the municipalities and the provinces. So at least in the social assistance and social housing example I gave you, there's a clear indication that in each case, one level of government's paying for about 75% of it. But there are other examples as well where it's much closer to 50-50. And so who to ask or who to call on for reform, and even who should just choose to spearhead it individually is a very open question. I think Sean will probably give you some examples at the federal level, federal with the provinces, including immigration and financial regulation, and a lot of other issues.
Yeah, that's a great example, Jonah. And the paper outlines approximately 10 or 12 areas where we don't have normative views or even evidence-based judgments about who ought to take responsibility for these different policy areas, but these are just policy areas where there is presently overlap and duplication that is causing some of the negative effects that we've discussed. Jonah mentioned social assistance and social housing between Ontario and Ontario municipalities. That's one. One that we've heard quite a bit, Drew, is around environmental regulations. So if you have a major project, oftentimes you are responsible for going through environmental regulatory processes at multiple levels of government, which can add time and costs associated with projects, even though ultimately, the standards by which these different levels of orders of government are using to make regulatory judgments are broadly the same. One example that I think is kind of interesting, which we allude to in the paper, is the role of policing. It's a bit less relevant in Ontario, but it actually has major national implications. Viewers may know that in several provinces, the RCMP, the National Police Force, isn't just responsible for national policing, it's also playing a role in provincial policing. And yet also we have, in some cases, local or municipal police forces. And so thinking about who does what, should we have a national police force playing provincial roles Or in so doing, is it actually standing in the way of the national police force stepping in and playing a major role in bigger national questions like terrorist financing and money laundering, questions around national security? These are all the types of things that we think a kind of sustained, systematic, evidence-based approach to intergovernment disentanglement can achieve. And the one reason, Drew, that we think this may have more salience than the kind of Big Bang model that we've been talking about is that this is a case where everyone is going to have to play a role. And the outcomes are not going to necessarily be tilted in one way or the other. There may be some areas where the result of a process of intergovernment disentanglement is that responsibilities are concentrated at the federal level because it makes more sense for Ottawa to assume those responsibilities. In other cases, it may be that the net effect is that the responsibilities are concentrated at the provincial or municipal level. So, I think through a systematic process, what we would see is in some cases, services uploaded, in some cases, services downloaded, but based on a kind of evidence-based judgment about who's best placed to provide those services. And I think, if we look at it holistically across the different areas that we've identified and others that no doubt would come forward as part of this exercise, we think that everyone can see themselves as part of the process. As I say, it'll be a bit of a mixed bag about, who does what. And we think if policymakers started to chip away at this list, we could actually, incrementally over time see a real improvement in the functioning of Canadian federalism. And so if you think about how to dedicate political capital, how to dedicate the attention and resources of different levels of government, in some ways, pursuing this iterative evolutionary process of intergovernment disentanglement may ultimately produce better effects than kind of putting all of our eggs in the basket of fundamental transformative reform, which in the end may end up unsuccessful, as Jonah says, has tended to be the case over Canadian history.
So final question, I'm going to, yes, Jonah.
Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to build on something Sean said in particular.
Please.
In the last couple of decades, under the Turnbull government and the Abbott government in Australia, there was a white paper written, and then there was a strong process that sought to disentangle every area at the same time, and that sort of fell apart. So although it's very important, we think that there's a whole host of areas that there should be disentanglement reform and can be. I would say that we should encourage the government of Ontario and any other government just to start the process. I mean, if there's some areas that are more controversial or less doable than others, disentanglement is something worth pursuing. And if it's got to be a staged process, that's fine too. We don't, as we've said, grand bargains are not necessarily always the solution here in Canada. But there's certainly areas that can get going very quickly, and some that might take a bit longer to iron out, like regulatory reform with respect to finance and such. But there are some that could happen quite quickly, and so we would recommend, moving forward in whatever way we can.
And I'm glad you underlined the example from Australia. We do note that in the paper, so thanks for that, Jonah. So to boil things down, we are talking about an agenda moving forward that is anything but Big Bang, but is fundamental in terms of taxpayer value and coherence in government. But at the same time, Sean, put on your hat from your time at the Prime Minister's office and the realism of policy at all three orders of government. This isn't something that's going to happen tomorrow, nor is it going to take a short period of time. How can the Ontario government lead with something like this as the biggest province, and what kind of timelines realistically should we be thinking about in the midst of a second wave of a pandemic?
It's a great question, Drew, and I think I would say two things and then just turn it over to Jonah to wrap us up, given that this project has really been, his intellectual leadership. The two things I would say quick is that Ontario and the other provinces have been working very closely together during the pandemic. There are reports that the premiers are speaking basically weekly through the mechanism of the Council of the Federation. And so, the first order, I think, is for Ontario, the Ontario government, to use its influence at the Council of the Federation to sort of rebalance the discussion about federalism reform So it's not narrowly focused on sort of sweeping changes to transfers and divisions of power, but that there's an equal level of attention placed to this question of intergovernment disentanglement. Ontario can do that, and I think build support across the different provinces for that kind of rebalancing and a commitment to the goal of intergovernment disentanglement. But the second thing it can do, Drew, is to lead by example. You know, we now have 2 papers published by the Ontario 360 project over the past 8 to 12 months. One that is focused precisely on the question of the relationship between the province of Ontario and its municipalities. And now the second paper, which sort of builds on that by thinking more nationally. There's nothing stopping the Ontario government from launching a who does what review here within the provincial borders to start to make progress on the entanglement that's incurred between the province of Ontario and its municipalities. Progress here within Ontario may be a catalyst for a more national effort around intergovernment disentanglement, and there's nothing standing in the way of Ontario doing that. And in fact, as Jonah has said, the consequences of the pandemic in many ways require it. And so, you know, obviously we're focused on the immediacy of the public health and economic challenges, but as the government starts to think about post-pandemic recovery, we think intergovernment disentanglement ought to be near the top of its priority list.
Jonah, last word to you.
Yeah, I would just say that certainly, as Sean mentioned, the government of Ontario can and should take a leadership role. There's a very easy way to demonstrate or walk the talk, so to speak, which would be to do reform with municipalities. And we mentioned how much their finances are hurting lately. I think also it's important to emphasize that, you know, a lot of reforms that we can call for, not these specific reforms, but in general, there's a lot of reforms that might appeal to one political party. There's some reforms that appeal to another. I think disentanglement is something that can really appeal to premiers across the country, regardless of political party, and even the federal government. Because this isn't, it's not to say, no, we want to slash, you know, spending or cut services or dramatically increase them. It's just a question of accountability and efficiency. And so we believe that this is something, as all the provinces and the federal government face massive deficits as a result of the pandemic. We just believe that this is something that can be pursued and something that should receive broad-based support across the ideological spectrum.
Great. Okay. Well, you know, a full conversation with regard to fiscal federalism, an agenda, a realistic agenda with regard to some of the reforms that would save taxpayer money, make government more coherent. The paper is on the Ontario 360 website, and I want to thank you, Jonah, and you, Sean, as the co-authors for taking us through it today. Thank you, and thank you to those of you who viewed our webinar. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.